I'd like to call to order the July 24th meeting of the City of Oak Harbor Planning Commission. It is now 6:30, and I would like to do the roll call first, and I'd like to point out, before we do that, our newest member, Zach Fellow. Welcome.
Thank you.
Zach. And Jess Walker-Weiss has turned in her resignation. All of the other active commissioners are here except for Waters, I believe, Aaron Waters. Second item on the agenda this evening is the approval of the minutes of May 22nd, as there was no June meeting this year. Do I have a motion?
I'll make a motion to approve the May 22nd, 2018 regular planning commission meeting.
I have a motion.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? You would abstain because you weren't at the meeting, but that's fine. I think our friend over there will take care of that for us. This is the time when we solicit public comment. We open the meeting up for the first 15 minutes for folks to address any issues that are not on tonight's agenda. Do I have any takers this evening? If not, I'll close that portion of our meeting. The next item is it's going to be a public hearing. It's the 6-year Transportation Improvement Program. And Senior Planner Kat Kamak is going to take that, and I believe backed up by Kathy Rosen this evening, is my understanding. Kat?
Good evening. Since we have some new members on the commission, I'll go ahead and kind of go over the TIP, the Transportation Improvement Program, from a 30,000-foot level, big scale, to then come down to our local government level, so that you have a better understanding of what it is that we're trying to do with this particular program. So at the federal level, they approve a big budget, transportation budget, and that money gets allocated to the different states, usually based on population, and then the states have to find a way to get that money to the local governments so that they can do street projects at the local level. The state does projects at the state level as well. So as the money comes down from the federal level to the state level to the local level, there are projects and things that are assigned for these projects over a span of years, and each of these jurisdictions, in order to access those funds, have to provide information and schedules for all of the money. So the way that money gets to local government is usually through planning organizations. They have some criteria actually for these transportation organizations, and it's based on population and so on. So just as an example, in the past, Whidbey Island by itself could not form a kind of a regional transportation planning organization because we didn't have the number of people it took, the minimum criteria that it took to have that. And so we partnered with Skagit County, and both of us put together, we were a regional transportation organization. And then as a two-county combined, we had enough to meet the criteria, and that's how we operated for many years. Well, as Mount Vernon and Burlington grew and their population grew, they came to a point where Skagit County could form its own regional planning organization to use the funds, and so they chose to do that, and so at that time it got split. Then the state legislature made some changes, knowing that Whidbey Island, Island County is now on their own, and so they had some legislation so that Island County can form their own RTPO, even though it doesn't meet the larger population criteria. So a couple years ago, that's what happened here in Island County. They formed their own Island County Regional Transportation Planning Organization so that we have a way to kind of access these federal funds that are mainly transportation funds. So this is federal dollars coming straight from the federal sources, so they have a lot of requirements in terms of how you spend this fund. So, a jurisdiction that's geared towards using these funds will have to do sometimes projects a little differently than you would be able to use your local funds for a street project. So part of that entire using of the federal funds, the TIP, Transportation Improvement Plan, is one of the tools that we use to try and document how we're going to use these federal dollars. So this TIP, what we're calling the 6-year TIP, is mainly to manage the federal funds. It's not to manage our street projects in its entirety. We have the capital improvements plan, and we have a street section in that where we do other projects other than what's in here, where we use local funds or other funds to do it. So this is mainly just for the federal funds. What projects we're using federal money for is what is documented here. And the way the process works is the IRTPO, Island County Regional Transportation Planning Organization, is a combination of all the cities and jurisdictions in Oak Harbor. Some of the port districts are also in there, and of course the county commissioners are also as part of the partnership. And so the IRTPO collectively, in the money that they get from the state, has to provide a similar document, a TIP, a 6-year TIP to the state. And because we are under Island County as an individual jurisdiction, we have to also go through the process of submitting a TIP and approval of these projects. So ultimately, we want our TIP that we're putting into this grand spreadsheet that is used by the state needs to be somewhat consistent with the IRTPO putting the list forward, and they're putting forward all the projects that we're putting forward, Langley's putting forward, Cookeville, and the county. So they are managing the entire group, and we're just doing one portion, our portion of it, taking these projects through. So that's kind of what we're doing. We do it every year, and the funding for this is different every year, just based on federal funds and how it's allocated. It's supposed to be a competitive process. It's grant money of sorts. Some of them require a match. It's one of the main funding sources on how we do streets. In the past, I think we've done Pioneer Way. Barrington Road was constructed, I think, with these funds. The Scenic Heights Trailhead was done with these federal funds. So we do depend on them for some of our revenues and projects. So what do we have and I have some slides I'll go through. So that's kind of like the big picture and what we're doing with the TIP. So if you don't see some street projects here, I mean, eventually the Planning Commission will get into the capital improvement plan as part of our comp plan update, and you'll see a lot more projects there because not only will these projects be included, we'll have other economic development projects and so on included in there, and that project is more showing of what Oak Harbor's street projects are. This is a small subset of just the federal funds that we're using. So that's just the context. So again, as I mentioned, the TIP is primarily to coordinate and manage the federal funds that we get. The money goes from federal to state to IRTPO. IRTPO allocates it to the local county and cities through a competitive process. There's two types of the categories you can apply for. One is called the STBG funds, which is the Surface Transportation Block Grant Funds, and this is usually all the big street projects get done through that. Now, if you want to do this project and if you get allocated, you do have to come up with a 13.5% match with local funds to do that. Another program that they have in there is a transportation alternative program. This is a program usually used for trail projects and other pedestrian projects. And this one doesn't have a match, so you can get 100% of the funding for a project for that. And the Scenic Heights Trailhead was done with that TAP money. So the IRTPO maintains a 4 to 6 year plan. At least the state requires 4 years. We do it at IRTPO level. We do a 6 year, because we do get a lot of projects at the IRTPO level, grant projects, and there's a team that looks at them. And some of these projects, you just have to push it out into the year, and they can, you can schedule it and you can plan for it because you have a 6 year plan. But the state actually requires just a 4 year plan. So you submit the TIP after we look at it to the state for approval. So what we're trying to do with this process is try to get consistent. When I say consistent, it's not going to be the same. And I'll tell you why right now, because of the timing of things. So the spreadsheet or the attachment that I have in your packet was done about 2 weeks ago, because that's when we generate reports. The IRTPO met just last week to rank some of the most recent applications, so it has already changed. Tomorrow, the policy board is going to meet on this. The policy board has authority, even though we have a lot of criteria. We follow plans, we have criteria. All the projects are ranked based on criteria, so it's a very scientific process on how we rank projects and how it moves forward. You can go to the policy board and it can get political at any time. No criteria, no nothing. If somebody doesn't like a project, they'll take it out. That's just how the world is. And so some of these may change even after it goes through Planning Commission, but that's okay. Every year we get to do this. We keep adjusting the schedule knowing that changes can come. So as long as we have the projects listed and we can plan for it, approximate timing of it, it's a good document, because these are funds that we rely on to do street projects. So even if it moves, we can be kind of steady. These funds are kind of tricky sometimes. For example, Langley may have a project that they are planning for, and something may go sideways and they're not able to do it. All of a sudden that money may be available. If we have engineering and project ready for something, our project can move forward. So it just depends on a lot of things. So these things kind of move around. Nonetheless, it is a planning document which we rely on. We try to connect this to our capital improvements plan and eventually to our budget, so that we can find that 13.5% local match so that we can use these grants. So it is a good tool for us to use, but it does change every year slightly. So that's just the context. So now that I've told you that those sheets have already changed, I have the most recent ones.
Thank you.
So, what do we have currently in the TIP? We have 3 projects that are good candidates for federal funds: the Northeast 7th Avenue reconstruction, Heller Street surface overlay, and the Waterfront Trail project. And I'll go through each of these projects a little bit, and also tell you what's going on at the TIP level. So starting off with Northeast 7th, this is an STBG application, the Surface Transportation Block Grant. It's a larger pool of money for the bigger projects. So in order to do Northeast 7th, the cost is about $4.6 million. That's kind of the estimate that we have right now. We have applied for some funds in the past. So every year we make some sort of application to keep projects current or to change on numbers based on increased costs or increased engineering. So every other year, not every year, every other year we have a chance to make some adjustments. So a couple of years ago, we did apply for the PE and some right-of-way for the Northeast 7th, and we actually got awarded that money. So when we get awarded that money doesn't come to our city and sit in the bank and accrue interest. It would be nice, but that's not the case. What we have to do is it still sits at the federal level, and we have to, when we get ready to do the project, we have to submit the bills, and they'll start to just, give us the money based on how much we expend. So even though we have that money granted, it's not sitting in our coffers, it's sitting still at the federal level. Once we get done closer to implementation, we can draw from it. So what's been approved for us, PE, about 242,000 for right-of-way, 540. So we actually applied for some additional funds this year because our PE increased a little bit. And again, we threw in an application. It competed with other projects. We were the third priority. There are two other projects that got higher priority than Northeast 7th. So what that means is when they come down to scheduling these money, the projects that are ranked 1 and 2 get to choose when they can schedule their project, and so we'll get the third priority to schedule our project. So it wasn't really high. We have that scheduled for that additional money for 2020 in our TIP. And then construction dollars, we did put that money in this year's application for it, but since we were the third priority, other projects took that money, and so we don't have the money for construction yet. So we still need to apply for it. So we have PE, we have right-of-way, we can continue to work on the project over the next 3 to 4 years, but we'll have to be vigilant in watching to apply for the construction dollars. Because, I mean, every year money comes in a little bit, and as the schedule moves, we'll try to put in an application so that we can apply for that $3 million. So, but all of this will have to translate. We still have to, STBG has 13.5% match. So in our CIP and in our 6-year budget, we still have to plan to have some dollars to match to spend this money, and that will come in our capital improvements planning process, which it will come towards forward to the Planning Commission in a month or two. So that's Northeast 7th. Heller Street overlay is again surface transportation block grant application. Total cost of this project is $361,952. This is an overlay project. This is kind of how we extend the life of infrastructure by overlaying it. You buy some more time before you have to really reconstruct it. If you don't do anything and if you let it fall to disrepair, then you have to go straight into reconstruction, which is a bigger project to do. So this one, again, we applied for funds in the past years. I want to say 3 or 4 years ago. I don't have the exact years. And the PE and the construction for that was awarded, and it's sitting in the 2022-2023 range. This one, again, requires the 13.5% match. And federal funds, they come with a lot of strings attached. So if you want to use federal funds, you have to be ADA compliant. So they'll give you the money for overlaying the street, but the city has to come up with the money to do the ADA ramps at the intersections and so on to match up with that overlay. So these are the strings attached in using federal dollars. You have to meet with those. So, so the city still has to budget money to try to use these dollars in that 22-23 year. Waterfront trail improvements. This is a TAP, Transportation Alternative Program application. The original application was for larger. This application was made a couple years ago, again, for a larger project to improve some signage and improvements along the entire waterfront trail. It selected about 6 or 7 sites to have, like similar to the kiosks at Scenic Heights, Scenic View, Trailhead. So similar to that, there was some plans to try and do 5 or 6 spots along the waterfront trail. And the total construction cost was proposed at almost $500,000, 400 and some odd thousand dollars. There's not that much of TAP money in the funding. What was approved was only $120,000. They said, we can't give you $400,000, but we'll give you $120,000. Well, that reduced the scope of the entire plan to just the VFW park. So the timing of when that slide happened and the sidewalks, the VFW was kind of close to this. So this kind of became the VFW improvement project. So 120,000 for that was granted, and we know that the cost of doing VFW project is actually higher than the 120,000. So this year we've applied for more money to try and do that project. So the total project cost is about 235,742. We've been given 120. We've applied for 115, and we think that at least at the technical level, committee level, we know that we can fund this project, but it still has to make the policy board and so on, and in order to get the full approval. Again, there's no match for this, so whatever money comes from here, we can use for the project. So those are the three projects that are in your tip. And as I mentioned, the policy board is meeting tomorrow, so they could make some minor adjustments. But I'm hoping that none of these will get dropped out completely from the tip. So just to summarize, it's to coordinate only federal funds. We are revising, the sheets are to try and be as much as consistent as possible with the IRTPO schedule. And this can change. So when we start to do our capital improvement planning for the city, and we try to do all our street projects and see our revenues, we have to still see if we can make that 13.5% match in that given year. And we may not be able to based on our revenue. And so we have to make adjustments maybe in next year's tip or the following year tip to match what we can fund practically to do that project. So this is still a moving game, but when it comes to closer to the project, we want to lock in. When we get closer to Northeast 7 construction, that's when we want to make sure that everything is locked in. So with the capital improvement plan, we'll do our best to match the dollars with the tip, and then eventually, when it gets to the 2-year budget, we'll know for sure if a project is moving forward or not. So those are the kind of steps after this. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. What we'd like the Planning Commission to do, this is just an approval process that the state requires for our TIP, is that we go through a public hearing process and the City Council eventually approve these projects. So we're here in front of you today for you to hold a public hearing and make a recommendation. So any questions?
Commissioners, questions?
I always have questions. A couple of things. So maybe I haven't been paying attention, but I thought the waterfront trail that they had expected to begin construction this summer on that repair. Did that get delayed for some reason?
No, we're still on schedule. We have that 120,000 already granted and obligated, and we actually, I think we have some city budget money as well to move that forward. If we get the grant money, we don't have to spend the city money. So we're trying to make that work.
And then on the Northeast 7th, so that's been pushed right a little bit, it looks like. So at the very earliest, maybe 2022 for some construction on that?
Probably further than that.
Yeah.
Because there's no money for the construction in the IRTPO funds right now for us.
And those
So-
go out 4 years, you said?
Mm-hmm.
And 4 to 6 years.
Yeah.
4 to 6, yeah.
So we're hoping things change. Sometimes, I mean, some things change. So, for example, the project on at Crescent Harbor and Regatta got delayed a year because they couldn't get the right of way in time, and so other projects sometimes will shift and try to utilize the money. So there's potential for projects to move, and we can try. But we'll make an application, like I said, the Northeast Avenue. We applied for construction money grant, but we just didn't get it.
So this $826,961 that's on here, is that money that you will have when it comes time?
So what we would have to, so the 188,000 and 540,000 federal dollars have been programmed for us, granted. We have to come up with a local match for that money. So by 2022, hopefully, we'll have 826 and we should have done engineering and we should have done the right of way by then.
And on a much more long-range look, that transportation plan that we worked on for last year, or whenever it was that got finished up, that goes out like 20 years or longer, and that had like 50 projects on it. There were the top 20, and then it went on and on and on and on. How many of those, just guesstimate, would actually qualify for these federal funds that you're talking
Any
about?
of them would. It's just trying to come up with a local match. So, even this Northeast 7th Avenue, when we get to the construction part of it, you have to come up with $500,000 as a local match. If we can come up with a local match all in 1 year, we can do the construction. Sometimes it takes 2 years to build up that amount. So we'll have to time it in such a way that we can obligate federal funds and use our local dollars. So it just depends on how much we can come up with. So Whitby Avenue is a great project to do, but yeah, we can go apply for grants, but that's a higher dollar amount. Can we come up with a match? And we have to budget for that. That's a big amount. So that's all done in the capital improvement plan. So are those candidates? Absolutely. It's just how much money can we come up with is the question.
So that's why they didn't show up in the,
Can I add on to that answer? A good rule of thumb is that anything other than local street projects will typically qualify for federal dollars. So none of these grants are available to use on our local streets, but for collectors and arterials, they're available for that. So
Thanks,
to
Steve.
the degree that there's anything that I don't remember that we have local street projects in there, but if there are local street projects shown in the overall transportation list from that transportation plan, those wouldn't be eligible, but the vast majority of the projects would be.
Thank you. That's a good distinction. Yeah, the federal dollars can be used for only federally designated streets, so you can't
that's
use
why
them
I
for
was
your
wondering,
residential
because
streets.
some of these, like, I don't know, Northeast Paysac may not be a,
Yeah, no. Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
as
no.
a-
it's eligible,
Good
yeah.
clarification.
As a
yes.
side note,
Yeah.
that's why Dennis was talking to the council about the Transportation Benefit District
right,
and why they took that step to at least put into place the ordinance that created that Transportation Benefit District. It's because if we continue to move forward with that and actually implement a funding source, those funds can be used on the local street. And that's what would help us plug that rather large gap we have in terms of being able to take care of our street network. Because while we have way more local streets than we have miles associated with collectors and arterial streets, as you heard me say, we can't use the federal dollars to maintain them or to repair them.
thank you. Thanks.
Any other questions, comments?
Yeah, I'd like to take a few stabs at this. Okay. Let me start with something you just said. What makes a street federally eligible?
I think our minor arterial collector.
There's a classification system that's nationally recognized. So we have local streets, collector streets, minor arterials, major arterials, and anything other than the local street will be federally eligible as a general rule.
Okay.
So
Seems peculiar to me that the feds would have any interest in that, but okay.
I mean, for example, our in Oak Harbor, the arterials are Whitby Avenue, Regatta, Oak Harbor Street, I think.
Barrington is a
Barrington,
collector street,
so-
so we had federal dollars in the Barrington project.
Yeah.
And so the Pioneer Way, as Kathy reminded me, I think the federal interest is, and I'm just speculating here, that the more major streets in the community have a more regional impact in terms of moving traffic through your community and into other communities. Of course, it's a little weird being on an island, right? Think someplace on the mainland, whereas perhaps the argument for local streets is that that's the local government's responsibility. And so there's also another system where they classify certain areas as urban versus rural, and there's some distinctions with those classifications. But to make it simple, big streets, yes, little streets, no.
Okay, fair enough. I was looking back over the history of this body's meeting packets, as far back as the website shows. And these projects keep recurring and keep not getting done. So this is maybe a big question, and maybe even outside of the scope of this body. I suspect that Zach will have an interest in this. Why is it so difficult for us to build streets in our own city, and why are we completely dependent on the feds for the money for this?
Good
I'll take a
question.
stab
Well,
at
that's a
that.
revenue question that is beyond this. Yeah. It's
Sounded like a question I should answer.
yeah.
So, excellent question. And it really comes back to the conversation that we had with the council here a few months ago about the Transportation Benefit District. And if we sort of peel back what that is supposed to do for us or can potentially help us do, is it helps us generate revenue that the local jurisdiction can use to spend on streets.
Okay.
Well, why do we need that funding source? Well, the reason that we need that funding source is because we're not able to fund all of our street needs through gas tax, property tax, and sales tax. Going back even farther in time, for those of you who lived in Washington in the very early 2000s, the end of 1990s and the early 2000s, we had some citizens initiatives that you might recall changed the motor vehicle excise tax. That taxing was a little bit out of skew, out of whack, and it really was being used as in part as a way to help fund those cities that didn't generate a lot of sales tax. It was called sales tax equalization, and those funds helped support our streets, our street program, both operations and maintenance, as well as street construction to the degree that a city of our size builds any streets. When the motor vehicle excise tax was changed to what was in theory a flat $30 tab rate, all that sales tax equalization went away. So we saw, which was not a lot of money available to us, but we saw that pot of money get even smaller. And so now we are barely able to fund our O&M with our gas tax. We also benefit from a special revenue source called CAPRON funds, which are funds only available, I think, to Island County and San Juan County. And it's not an acronym. It's the last name of the state legislator who proposed this particular funding source. And so we do our local streets with gas tax and CAPRON funds. And it's for cities that have maybe a more robust sales tax generators or more robust property tax. They can take some of their general fund dollars and push that into their streets. We're not one of those fortunate communities. So it's all about available funding for us, and that's what drives our ability to tackle any of these big projects. So whether it was Barrington, when we did the missing link of Barrington on the side of the hill a number of years ago, whether it was Bayshore Drive connection that we were referencing earlier in our pre-meeting between behind Whidbey Island Bank and behind the South Side 7-Eleven, whether it was a major reconstruction of Pioneer Way, we have to come up with those funds almost exclusively through the RTPO or through some other funding sources we have, like real estate excise tax. But that source can also be used for park improvements and park acquisition. So now we're into that balancing act, or rather the council is into that balancing act. Where are we going to put those dollars? You can only slice the pie in so many ways.
Sure.
So that's sort of street funding 101 in a nutshell.
Okay. Okay. I'm gonna ponder on that for a while longer.
Sure.
No, I guess that's it. Thank you. Thanks, Steve.
I think maybe appropriate we open the public hearing at this time, so I'll open the public hearing and solicit any comments, suggestions, questions from the audience. Or once again, commissioners, if you have anything else on your mind, you're welcome to speak, inquire.
Alan hit mine, so I'm good.
Glad I could help.
Thanks.
Anyone, no takers? No other public comment? If not, I'll close the public hearing. And now we'll entertain a motion.
I move that we recommend the city council adopt the 2019 to 2024 six-year transportation improvement program.
I'll second the motion.
There's been a motion and second. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion passes. Good job, CAC. The next item on the agenda this evening is the Garry Oak Tree Protection Ordinance. And this also will be a public hearing, and CAC Kamek will lead us through this also.
Right.
Senior Planner
Thank
CAC.
you. This is the introduction of the text amendments to the Garry Oak standards. The Planning Commission was briefed on this at previous meetings several times, I think a couple times. But nevertheless, I'll just go over a quick summary of where it all began and what we're recommending to the City Council. So looking into these text amendments originated from a while ago when the city was considering adjusting the variance code. So just another historical kind of summary. So years ago, when the city decided that they wanted to regulate Garry Oaks and preserve them, as they came up, I think they hired a consultant, they came up with a set of code languages to deal with Garry Oak trees. And that stood by itself. Like if you look at the Oak Harbor Municipal Code, you got, zoning, and you got several titles underneath of it, landscaping and residential development standards and native vegetation standards, whatever. So each one's got little, and oak trees had its own section. And there were several sections in there, and because it was kind of done separately and attached, it was kind of had some repetitive language in there that was already covered in other parts of the code. And so back in 2005, they made some changes to try and clean that up. And at that time, they decided that the Garry Oaks were a critical area, similar to wetlands, and moved a lot of the regulations of that into the environment section of the code that deals with critical areas, wetlands, geological features, and all the aquifer recharge areas that we have in the environment section. However, there was some language that was related to variances for Garry Oaks that were put in the variance section of the zoning code. And what that did was it said, basically, I think it was under the premise, if you had a Garry Oak tree on your property, you could move a house around on that lot to accommodate that Garry Oak tree. But it put a restriction on there, that variance language, the old language said, you can move that house around, but you couldn't get it closer to the property line than 5 feet or something like that. There was some limitation. And for some reason, at that time when they adopted the code, they considered setbacks to be of a higher priority than preserving the Garry Oaks. Nobody used that code, I don't think, even though that was there. Eventually we had a lot that had a Garry Oak tree, and they wanted to put a house on it, and no matter how much they moved it on the lot, they couldn't meet that 5 feet requirement. They had to get it closer. And so we were like, well, this doesn't make sense. Let's just take this limitation out. If we have a Garry Oak tree, let's give them the maximum flexibility to move that structure so that they can get the use of the lot and you can preserve the tree. So we moved forward a code amendment to consider that variance and language change. And during that time, there was some public input saying that we need to increase our standards for protecting Garry Oak trees, especially during construction. Since we were dealing with the variance language at that time, that wasn't the best time to meddle with the language because it's separate code. So we said, okay, we'll come back. And so that's kind of where we are now. That process has led us here. So what are the things that, the main concern was there's a language in our current code that says suitable protective measures shall be taken to protect. And it was very general. What that did was it was based on site-specific challenges, so because every oak tree and every property is different, and so relied on the conditions on ground to deal with protective measures. Usually, if it was a challenging situation, we'd ask the owner to hire an arborist to deal with it. And then they would have to come up with a specific construction plan and so on. And this works really good for new development if you can do that. Where it really becomes challenging is when you have alterations or additions to a house or repairs that you want to do and there's an oak tree. Then it becomes difficult to deal with in terms of suitable measures. So based on the interest from the community and the interest group, we looked into some of these more specific protective measures for the oak trees. So the proposed code it talks about establishing a critical root zone. I think if you look at a lot of the literature, they talk about how to preserve an oak tree is to try and preserve that soil conditions and soil configuration around the tree as much as possible, because the tree has taken so long to adapt to that environment. You want to try and protect that. If you don't have measures to protect that, usually you're kind of writing the death sentence for a tree in the long span of time. So you want to establish a critical root zone. You want to try and make sure that you don't disturb it during construction. So you put up a barrier, you put up signage for people that are working on site to make sure that they understand that they need to not disturb the soil composition. Kind of identifying a root size to protect. So, I mean, we have a lot of Garry oak trees in the older part of town, and people want to add to it, or they want to do this utility construction that happens, sewer lines that get built or replaced, and they have to cut pretty close to a tree sometimes. So we want to establish some minimum tree roots. Some tree roots can be cut and still they'll survive, but we've identified like 4 inches as a kind of a measure to limit that type of activity. And of course, any type of contamination, storage of materials for construction should be done away. So the proposed language has all these measures. Now, this will require, so if somebody wants to do an alteration, they come to the city, they want to do this alteration, if they have a Garry oak, we'll ask them for these documentations to be provided. So a property owner will have to tell us basically through either drawings or indicate how they're going to work with these protective measures. Now, there may be situations where it's difficult for them to determine how to protect it, and it may be difficult for us to determine. We're not experts necessarily in Garry. So there may be a time when we say, okay, we both can't figure it out. You do need an arborist to do this. So we included a clause to still be able to invoke that provision of getting an arborist to deal with situations. So during this code amendment process, we got input from the Garry Oak Society. There's a clause in the code about harm shall not be done to oak trees, blah, 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 but they wanted specifically to mention ivy. There's a lot of ivy that grows on the island, and they're choking out the Garry oak trees, so they wanted to have that specified in there as something that's harmful for the trees, so we've added that language in there. And during the SEPA review process, we got some input on, it says, our code title says oak tree protection. And in our critical area definitions, we define what we mean by oak tree, and it's the Garry oak tree. But unless you know to look for it, you think all oak trees are protected, which is not the case. We have several pin oaks and other oaks in the community which people can trim and do what they want. It's the Garry oaks that needs to be protected. So we wanted to just get that language in there to specify that as well. So the proposed code in front of you has these specific measures, includes the ivy as a harmful species to the Garry oak, and also clarifies that it's the Garry oak tree. So that's what's in front of you. The code revision text amendments require a couple criteria to meet consistent with the comprehensive plan, which it is, because we have several policies in our comprehensive plan in protecting the Garry oak trees. It's in our vision statement, and so it's consistent with our plan. promoting health, safety, and welfare. Garry Oaks are part of the environment of Oak Harbor. That's where it gets its name. It's good to protect it. And in protecting it, you're protecting a habitat for the community and also a cultural value for the community. Therefore, in that way, it does promote the health, safety, and welfare for the community. So it meets those criteria. So we recommend that the Planning Commission hold a public hearing and then make a recommendation to the City Council on the proposed language. Any questions?
I have a few if that's okay.
Yeah.
First off, how does someone know if they move into a house or buy property here in town? How do they know that they have a Garry Oak on their property?
The trees are pretty distinctive. I remember when I drove into town and looked at these trees and I thought they are kind of a different looking tree. And so there's no, they'll have to find out. They'll find out one way or the other. Usually what I've seen are people buying homes because they like Garry Oak trees. They buy in the older section of town. A lot of people are familiar with it. A lot of people know. I think I picked up the phone book when I came here to read it, and that was actually in a phone book as a little fun fact sheet. So I think there's several ways to find out that it is a regulated. Otherwise, your neighbors will tell you very quickly if you start to do that.
Oh, yes.
You'll find out one way or the other.
Okay. And then
Before or after the fact.
my other question is more or less, where do we draw the line on private property and city interfering with the citizens' personal property and their right to do what they want on their land?
Good question. Court systems have given cities many authority to do it. For example, zoning is a regulation of private property in the sense of how you can use it. So a residential property cannot be used as a commercial property, even if you want to use it. So it's
Correct.
a regulation of private property. So there are some authority given to the city to regulate this. How far you want to go into that regulation is always tested in the court system. Tree regulation is not new to cities around Western Washington and other cities as well. So it's within the realm and authority to do that. And because of the Garry Oak and its prominence and it's a namesake, usually courts will look at, do you have a plan? They look at what's the community's vision and are there regulations in match with that vision, and we have a good string of things to connect on why we want to regulate oak trees.
Okay. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yes, please.
Yes.
I met with Mrs. Reninger from the Garry Oak Society. We had an interesting conversation, and she pointed me toward a property that's under redevelopment now on Southeast 9th, where they're tearing down the house that has a Garry Oak tree in the yard. And so I called over to the construction company working on it, Walton Construction, to see how that had been, how much impact that it had on them. And they said it was not a problem on that particular property. The tree, where it was located, they've got a fence around it so they don't interfere with it, and the impact to their process was not a big deal. He also said that the amount of that impact can vary with where the tree is on the property, which completely makes sense. But generally, he said, we just want to follow the rules. As long as we know what they are, that's fine. So some of the concerns I had when we talked about this 2 months ago about being a problem for developers and private property, kind of what you were touching on, Zach, I'm sorry. It's something that they're going to have to look at on a case-by-case basis. But overall, I think it's probably okay. One thought that came to mind, and my realtor will kill me for saying this in public, but would this be a place where we would want real estate agents operating in the city of Oak Harbor to have some kind of form like the jet noise form when they're selling a piece of property with a Garry Oak on it, to make sure that the owners are aware that they have this added responsibility?
I mean, it is one of the ways you can. The jet noise one, applies to almost citywide or region-wide. And so implementing a rule like that for all property transactions kind of makes sense in the region because it's a larger impact.
Sure.
Oak trees are they are more in specific areas, so I'm not I'm not sure if we're trying to do something, require something so big for every property transaction that applies to only a small. So it's just a balance. It's a policy. Can we? Sure. I mean, is there a real desire for us to do it? And is there impact? Have we gotten a good way to get people to understand? I think it's great to have volunteer organizations, not-for-profit organizations that have interest in these things, so that it's not all city-regulated rules and regulations. Promotion and of Garry Oaks through organizations like that will have culturally bigger impact than having it be a requirement, in terms of a rule and a law. So it's just a balance.
Okay. I am the last person who's going to argue for putting some more burden on these kinds of things, but it seems like potentially a logical outcome of what we're talking about here.
Alan, can I talk to that?
Absolutely.
So my day job is as a realtor.
Sure.
And the state requires all home sellers to fill out a seller's disclosure form. One of the sections on there is environmental, and there's questions about critical areas on there.
Oh, okay.
So depending on how you interpret it, you could suggest certainly that it should be disclosed on the seller's disclosure form.
That would make a lot of sense.
That would
Yeah.
make sense.
Yeah.
Especially because we have this clause here, 2016 Note 10, section, paragraph 1, where the harm is prohibited. But there's no consequence specified if you allow harm to come to these trees. And I was wondering why that is.
The critical area violations are part of the critical area. I mean, so the Environment Code has several sections, and Oak Tree is one section. Violation of any of the critical areas is contained in the critical area section.
Mm-hmm.
So that violation will apply to any violations of critical areas.
Okay.
So it's not, every chapter doesn't spell out the violation separately.
Should that section have a reference to the critical areas ordinance, ordinance to tie that together?
It's already there.
Is it?
So Title 20 is the environment title.
Mm-hmm.
And as CAC has mentioned, there are several different chapters in there. One of them, of course, is this chapter 2016. There's one of the other chapters.
2012, I think.
Is 2012 is the general regulations, and then which I think talks a little bit about penalties. And if memory serves me correctly, there's a separate chapter about penalties as well.
Okay.
And so, in the code world, that connection is there.
Fair enough.
Because it's all in the same title.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense then. And then I know that the good people from the Garry Oaks Society had wanted to have the first three pieces in Section 2 prefaced with prior to construction. So prior to construction, they'd have to establish the critical root zone. Prior to construction, installing an access deterring fence. And prior to construction, posting the highly visible and legible signs. Is there a reason why we didn't put that in?
That would, I mean, when we can, but that's already implied in the permit obtaining process.
Okay.
So, so I'm not sure if it'll make a difference, because that's part of our requirements when we go through and when they do the paperwork and before we get the permit. And before they start construction, our inspection crews are out there to make sure that those are happening. So it's just part and parcel of what we do.
Okay.
So,
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough. The last question I had is, in talking with the gentleman from Waldron Construction, he said that this is much more of a problem for them when they're working on redeveloping properties, like the one he's working on now, infill properties, more or less, in the southeast quadrant of the city. Do we have any sense of how many infill properties there are in that section of the city and how many of them are affected by these trees?
I don't think we have a count, and candidates for infill could be varied. You know, yeah, we may have some vacant lots that you can build on, but we talk about redevelopment, or we're talking about a large lot being further subdivided. You know, we haven't looked into that detail of an analysis to determine how many properties will be impacted. However, we did internally at least discuss that, you know, redevelopment, alterations, additions, they are going to be challenging. They are, I mean, there's just no way around it. And property owners will be expected to provide a lot more information or think through their construction plans if there is a Garry oak tree on their property. Yeah, it's going to be challenging even for staff to look at whether the information that they have provided is adequate to protect the tree. Sometimes there may not be enough room.
Yeah.
You know, we have a lot of trees that are sitting adjacent to homes. And so when you say, okay, you got to measure, you know, the diameter of the tree trunk, and then you got to provide this, it may not be possible in all instances to protect the entire 360 degrees of that tree. Half of that may already be under the house. So, I mean, there are some challenges, and we have to deal with it on a case-by-case basis. And if it's really difficult, that's why we have that arborist evoke and say you need to work with an arborist that's is specifically knowledgeable about construction standards and tell us, come up with a plan on how we're going to do it. And that can increase costs, that can increase or change ideas or be a game stopper in certain instances. But that's just nature of, we priced Garry oak trees as a important, valued asset to the community. It does come with those kind of challenges.
I think the reality is that there are, where the Garry oak trees are predominant, there are no properties that you would consider to be anything other than infill, essentially, because there aren't any large size pieces where we're going to see a large subdivision or even a large short plat of any size of consequence. And so I think you can say to yourself that we're dealing with either situations where we have existing structures which are seeking to expand or somehow modify their footprint, and that's where these regulations will come into play. Or we're in a situation where maybe there are some vacant lots still scattered around in the southeast portion of the community. And the third situation is probably one where the land value is worth more than what the structure value is, and the structure comes down. And then we see new, a couple of new units or one nice new large size unit there. But I think they would all fall under the umbrella of what we would think of as infill.
Okay.
Because of where the Garry oak tree environment is in our community.
Right. Oh, I'm just, this is going to touch on, we're going to talk about housing later in the year, and affordable housing is going to be kind of a recurring topic. And I'm curious about how this, which makes things slightly harder to build, is going to interact with those pieces as we come up on them.
So one of the things that you'll hear from us in different ways throughout all of these presentations, and CAC has just touched on it a bit, is the concept of balance. Mm-hmm. And as we all know, at any point in time, there are competing interests on just about everything. Yeah. Our own comprehensive plan is a great example. There are 13 goals from GMA. They don't all line up in concert with each other very often, if at all. Right, because if you're promoting one particular goal, it may be not so much at the expense of another one, but that other one or other ones might become subservient to that goal. And as CAC said, the community made the choice a very long time ago that the Garry oak trees in our city are worthy of protection. And so, assuming that continues to be "quote unquote" the law of the land. It's going to affect how some of our other laws come into place, or how they're actually utilized. And to the degree that this might increase certain costs associated with development, that's part of the balancing as we look at preserving this part of our community.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and I'll go off on a little side note because it relates to affordable housing or just generally housing costs. Some, regulations such as these went to a recent planners forum. We're talking about historical properties, creating historical districts that were created because certain districts were kind of getting dilapidated, structures getting, so laws are put into place to preserve these structures. There are some property owners interested in doing that, and they come in, they do these redevelopment projects. These projects get really good, they turn out to be really good. All of a sudden, the houses around there get really good. So when all of a sudden, you're looking at homes that are outside of the affordable. I mean, what you started off with a redevelopment project to get an area up has been successful, but the result of that can also have its own issues and affordability, and nobody has a good solution to that because we're implementing tools to better our areas in town, which naturally increases the value. So do we have a magic solution for that? No, but that's what the balance is, to balance it out.
All right, thank you. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Anybody else?
I had one other thing. I'm sorry, Pat.
Yeah.
All right, 2016-020, paragraph 1. At the very end, wherever feasible, dead Garry oak trees shall be left as snags for their habitat value. So if they're left as snags, over time they will rot, correct?
Yes.
So how long does a property owner have to keep that on their property before they can push to have it cut down or removed?
It's their choice. The ones that we've seen so far, there are actually a couple on Midway that we've told people, it's the tree is pretty much dead. If you want to cut the limbs that you think are dangerous, that's fine, and leave. And some of the property owners choose that because it's a lot of money. They have to pay somebody to come and cut the tree. So if they can cut a few branches off and get a few more years, push it down the road, that's fine. So we do have a couple snags that have been left, but we tell them anytime you think it's dangerous, come and let us know, and that's an easy permit because it's on an already dead tree.
Okay.
If they want to take it down, they can take it down. So there's no regulations. It's the property owner's decision. If they think it's unsafe, they can come and ask for a permit to take it down.
Okay, thank you.
At this time, I think I will open the public hearing and solicit comment. I see Laura is coming to the podium.
Good evening, Commissioners, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Laura Reniger from the Oak Harbor Garry Oak Society. As I mentioned at the May Commissioners meeting, our group endorses the revisions to the Oak Tree Protection Code, and we certainly applaud the recent work of the Planning Department staff. To quote former Planning Commissioner Cecil Pierce regarding city planning, "This is not Seattle. This is not Bellingham. This is our community, the community that we want here in Oak Harbor." I would add that a very important part of our identity is being the town that contains the iconic oaks. Adequate Garry oak protection during building and construction is paramount. The revised code is an important part of successful oak tree protection efforts because it is now in line with forestry best management practices developed and recommended by industry professionals such as arborists. Hopefully you had a chance to look at this already. The reference booklet on tree protection published by Oregon State University Extension details out what is best practice for tree protection in the Pacific Northwest, and its guidelines are echoed now in our revised tree protection code. Keeping Garry oaks healthy during construction and development will ensure our urban Garry oaks will continue to remain standout trees in our landscape. Another way the revised code is better than before is because English ivy kills oak trees, and now we have language that closes the ivy loophole. Oak Harbor Garry Oak Society, the citizens of our community, and the city have made monumental strides in the last 3 years towards planting and protecting our legacy trees. This revised code will help ensure that Garry oaks will always be in Oak Harbor. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Laura. Do we have any other public comment or questions?
Good evening, gentlemen of the Planning Commission. I'm Kyle Renninger, a fifth-generation Whidbey Islander and one of the founding board members of the Oak Harbor Garry Oak Society. Much like you, I love this island and the wonderful community of people who live here, and I strongly urge you to approve the revised Oak Protection Ordinance. The revision to this ordinance was a long time coming, born out of the realization that some sections of the code, as CAC explained, are vague, which has resulted in a documented lack of crucial protections for our legacy Garry oak trees during construction and development, and from other threats, such as invasive ivy, which strangles and kills our legacy oak trees. Why is the Garry oak tree worth our time and protection? Besides being the city's namesake, the Department of Fish and Wildlife in Washington State has classified the Garry oak as critically imperiled and at risk of extinction. Again, this tree species from which we derive our town's name, our local culture, and our sense of place is critically imperiled and at risk of extinction. The many Garry oaks of Oak Harbor, they're not just another forest. They're not just another tree. We have evidence that they were purposefully planted as a nut orchard by the Native Americans who once inhabited this area. The ancient trees we enjoy today and are now stewards of are living monuments to our Native American heritage. It is out of respect for those who came before and for the generations to come that we adequately protect what we care most about. It's also important to remember that the critical root zone protection is an incredibly fair compromise for landowners, as oftentimes the full root zone of the tree extends well beyond the critical root zone. By protecting just this bare minimum, the tree has a significantly higher chance of survival during development and construction. Many other municipalities have tree protection ordinances, but oftentimes they protect all the tree species, any and all tree species. In Oak Harbor's case, we only protect one, our most iconic and most beloved Garry oak. This revision was carefully crafted to balance the overwhelming need for Garry oak tree protection with respect for private property owners and their right to reasonable development, with many opportunities for flexibility. This allows everyone to have their cake and eat it too. To Commissioner Phillips' point, snags are incredibly important. Over the historic life of a tree, eventually they will turn into snags. Over time, certain species have evolved to actually use those snags and require the certain cavities that are created by those snags. So as we think of the lifetime of the tree, even the snags, even the dead trees are important.
Okay.
So therefore, I strongly urge you to approve the revised Garry Oak Protection Code. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Colin. Any other public comment? Questions? If not, I will now close the public hearing and ask for a motion, please.
I move the motion. My answers were answered.
You have to read it.
Yeah.
You have to read the motion now.
Oh. I'm gonna do this whole thing. I'm with this.
Action.
Oh, great. I'm skipping recommended action. Go ahead. Can't find it.
I can forward it.
All right.
I make a motion that we move the amendment to the Oak Harbor Municipal Code, Chapter 20.16 to in ordinance number 1839 be forwarded to the City Council with a recommendation for approval.
I second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion passes. Thank you, CAC, once again. And the last item this evening is the Comprehensive Plan Amendment Park Plan Update. And this is a public meeting, and CAC will help us with this also.
You'll be happy to know that I don't have an update on this yet. We are working on updating the document and also gathering up some information to deal with the park impact fee. That's kind of what we're working on. I don't have enough information to to share with you to have any meaningful discussion. So we'll just come back next month to deal with it.
Thank you, CAC. I'd like the public to know that the next regular business meeting is slated for August 28th. And there being no further business, this meeting is adjourned.